Hello again, welcome back to Insight. Now, in the first part of the programme, we focused on the migrant camp in northern France that became known as the Jungle. Now we're looking at the wider situation across Europe. I'm joined by Callum Payton, who's a Middle East reporter who's covered the refugee crisis for weekly news magazine Newsweek. Also joining us on Skype from Turkey is Elif Çetin, who's a researcher specialising on migration for the University of Cambridge. Welcome to both of you. Elif, let me start with you. Statistics show that more than 1 million migrants crossed into Europe in 2015. Well, we're now in 2017, and those figures don't show any signs of diminishing, do they?
Not really. As the conflict in Syria continues, the situation will also continue.
And the people who are fleeing the war, the persecution, they're finding new routes into Europe. Despite the dangers, they are continuing to cross.
That's right. The conflict in Syria continues to be by far the biggest driver of the migration to Europe. There was a surge of the numbers of Syrians arriving to Europe during the summer of 2015. And as you just pointed out, the situation is still the same, even though the numbers went down a little bit. Having said that, the ongoing violence in Afghanistan, abuses in Eritrea, as well as poverty in Kosovo are also leading people to look for new lives elsewhere. So we are not just talking about migration coming to Europe from Syria.
Callum, we were talking earlier in the programme about Calais and the bottleneck of refugees growing there, trying to get into England. But how far is that picture repeated across Europe? Groups of refugees desperately trying to cross borders into Europe?
Well, I mean, what you have and what you've had throughout the crisis, so since 2014 and then into its peak in 2015, is the real bottlenecks have always shifted of where this crisis would be. So, as we've already mentioned in the summer of 2015, when the numbers were at their absolute highest, you had this real bottleneck, first of all, on the Aegean coast in Turkey, with people trying to come into Europe, and then also at the same time in Calais, where migrants were finding new ways to get through that they would be successful with to begin with. But then governments or local authorities would react, the situation would change, and then you would see new routes popping up. Say, so when it became harder to cross the sea, to cross the Aegean, which is where the majority of the Syrians, as we've already said, the largest drivers of the crisis, also Iraqis fleeing the conflict in their own country. When it became harder to cross by the sea, you saw more people coming then over land and further into the Balkans from that route. So the problem doesn't go away just because new solutions to stop it in one area take effect.
OK, well, let's talk about the European response. Elif, we have seen European countries closing their borders, making deals with countries like Turkey to try and keep more refugees there. What has the European response been to the issue of so many people trying to flee conflicts and war?
Well, what we see is a security-oriented approach followed by Europe. In fact, over the past 25 years, the European Union has constructed what many justly call as Fortress Europe, keeping out migrants not with fences, but with warships, helicopters, and surveillance drones. The emphasis on achieving border security has unfortunately resulted in the further tightening of legal entry routes for those who want to reach Europe. This has been highly counterproductive, as harsher border controls actually bolster human smuggling. So I would like to note that putting all the blame on human smugglers for the appalling fatalities happening at the EU's external borders is just a self-serving strategy of European politicians. The core problem does not lie with irregular migration, but with dysfunctional immigration policies and alarmist rhetoric. For real change to happen, European politicians should resist the temptation to criminalize and also further politicize immigration. Instead, additional legal entry channels should be created through tighter collaboration among the member states that would pave the way for a longer-term solution.
Elif has put her finger on the problem that the big issue with migration and refugees, although there's sympathy for the reasons that they're running from their countries, is when it comes right down to it, domestic politics, security being a big issue. We saw Germany say, look, come here, we will take in more refugees. That proved incredibly unpopular with voters. So we are seeing this fortress Europe.
I mean, the effect that the migrant crisis had on Europe as a whole and on European politics, I actually really don't think can be understated at all. What I find surprising is how little coverage the story gets now, considering the real effect, the real knock-on effect the peak in 2015 had, say, on the referendum in Britain on whether to remain in the EU. Migration became one of the real central issues to that. If we look at the recent elections also in France, the kind of unprecedented levels of support for Marine Le Pen, even though she didn't win and she didn't do as well as maybe her base might have hoped. Again, they were able to really play on fears about migration and the problems with security. And again, if we look at the recent terror attacks here in the United Kingdom, or we look at terror attacks that had happened in France or in Germany or in Belgium in the last year and year before, again, always a question that was asked in the aftermath was, what are the security strategies? Can we afford to have migration if these people can get in, even if it's a very, very small minority? But
if you look at it on a purely human level, you know, often the whole debate about immigration gets reduced to statistics and security, but looking at a human level, I mean, the number of children, for example, who are fleeing, 100,000 children applied for asylum, and these are extremely vulnerable to traffickers. I mean, there are whole generations here of young people who need help.
Yeah, I mean, the face of what this actually looks like on the ground in comparison to the way that it is often portrayed in the media is at times polar opposites. So when you go to the Calais migrant camp, you will interact with kids. They're 12, 13 years old who are from Syria, and they've been fleeing Aleppo, and they will be unaccompanied. They will be considered vulnerable people by most Western governments and by the United Nations, because their entire families have been killed in bombing raids, and now they're traveling. They've traveled on their own perilous journeys to come to the West, you know, one of the Western most northern points of Europe. Similarly, if you go to refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, there is always this problem of unaccompanied children, and also children who have missed 1 or maybe even 4 years of school, and then it's very difficult to reabsorb those kids back into an education system which is already under great strain. I mean, when we talk about the European migrant crisis, the thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and possibly because it's so obvious to those of us who talk about it all the time, is the real burden of this crisis, particularly when we talk about Syria and Iraq, is placed on those neighboring countries, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, all of which there have been 5 million Syrian refugees. So these are people displaced from outside of the country so far. 3 million of them are in Turkey, and somehow Turkey needs to find a way to cater for them.
Let me put a quick last question to Elif, because the UN Refugee Agency is saying that over 1 million people will need to be resettled next year. Is there a plan for where these people are going to go?
Well, thank you very much for this question. It's an important point, of course. What's going to happen with these people? What sort of a future is waiting for them? So what we can see is that the conflict in Syria won't come to an end at any time soon. And there are already more than 2 million Syrians only in Turkey, around 1 million in Lebanon. So we are talking about quite sizable numbers of people who are already living in these countries. And we need to think about their integration into their new societies. I wouldn't like to use the term host country because, as I said, most of these Syrians are going to just stay in either in neighboring countries, or the ones who found a way to get asylum in different European countries will probably also stay there. There will be future generations of Syrians who will basically have those hyphenated identities. So we need to have a longer term vision here instead of just focusing on numbers and their resettlement, but we also need to start talking about their integration and what we can do. I think that is the real question here. Instead of controlling numbers or reducing the numbers of Syrian population in Europe, we need to be thinking about what sort of a future they can have in those new societies.
Do for these people. No easy solutions, but thank you very much indeed for joining us today, Alif Chetin and Callum Paynton. Thank you both of you. And that's it from us for now. I'm Shuli Ghosh. You are watching Insight.